never thought today would come. Growing up, we were always told never again. Never again could we allow the wholesale violence and persecution of minorities. Never again could we scapegoat the vulnerable to appease the egos of fragile bullies. Never again could we allow fear to overrule the angels of our better natures. But here we are. As I record this in January of 2026, government paramilitary organizations, under the umbrella of immigration enforcement and the Border Patrol, are responsible for terrorizing American communities nationwide. The president has targeted the strongholds of his political opponents, especially Minneapolis and Chicago. Paramilitary thugs have kidnapped children to gain access to immigrant homes, are blatantly provoking protesters in the hope for a violent crackdown, and have murdered U.S. citizens Renee Good and Alex Pretty in cold blood. If federal escalation continues, Minneapolis could become our Kristallnacht. It is already similar to the early deportations of Jews in Germany in the 1930s. Worse, as much as I hate to admit it, we are all guilty. If not of collaboration, then of the complacency and inaction that allowed America to get to this point. Much as Germans had to reckon with their national guilt after Nuremberg, Americans must reckon with our own today. All of us, each and every one, could have done more to prevent the terror that has come to our neighbors' doors. The bravery of community ICE observers in Minneapolis and elsewhere only serves to highlight that reality. Maybe you still doubt. Maybe you say to yourself, I am no Eichmann. I am a decent person who has always opposed this regime. It's not my fault. I'm as scared and angry as everyone. How can we all be guilty? Here's the problem. Guilt sucks. It's the worst. We all hate feeling guilty, worrying about what we've done wrong, blaming ourselves. So we repress it. We ignore the feeling or blame other people for their part in a bad situation, while ignoring our own faults. And sometimes we are right to do so. Abusive parents love to manipulate guilt to control their children, to make them less independent. Cult leaders do the same thing, making their followers feel constantly monitored and ashamed. But guilt has a purpose. Guilt is a guidepost. It exists to make us recognize when we have done something wrong or when we have looked the other way and not done enough to prevent the evil happening right in front of us. So when should we feel guilty? Should we feel guilty for not preventing the actions of others? Or the actions of a society where we lived, whose government committed atrocities? Put it another way, when should we hold ourselves responsible for the actions of others, and how? In 1947, faced with a divided Germany, confronting its shame after the Nuremberg Trials revealed the Nazi atrocities of the Holocaust, Karl Jaspers asked his students, colleagues, and himself the same questions. Today, we need to ask them again, particularly if we are Americans. In this deep dive, I hope to do three things. First, to define what Jaspers meant by guilt, and how his distinctions are essential in clarifying our own frequent arguments about individual responsibility. Second, to explain why he considered a focus on universal moral guilt to be a productive discussion in post-war Germany. Third, to dive into the question of when and how individuals can be morally responsible for group actions, and to connect that responsibility to the current situation in Minneapolis. Even if you find philosophy boring, I urge you to watch at least the last section of this video. We all need to grapple with how we can do better to stop violent atrocities from happening in our own countries. As always, the video is divided into chapters with timestamps in the description. In a lecture at the University of Heidelberg, Jaspers confronted the challenge of a guilty nation in no uncertain terms. He came to a stark and uncompromising conclusion. Everyone in Germany, whether supporter of the regime, fence-sitter, or even staunch opponent, shared in the guilt of the Holocaust. Where they differed was in the kind of guilt that they possessed. Everyone should feel guilty, Jaspers argued, but some were more responsible than others. To explain what he meant, Jaspers divided the idea of guilt into 4 different subtypes, and while his typology is subject to a lot of debate and disagreement, it remains the starting point for philosophic discussions of moral and political responsibility to this day. Jaspers' 4 types of guilt are criminal guilt, political guilt, moral guilt, and metaphysical guilt. Properly understood, these 4 categories clarify a lot of the confusions that arise when we discuss the responsibility for both individual and group actions. The first category is the simplest, and the first that comes to most people's minds. Criminal guilt is guilt according to the formal, institutional legal system. It is the guilt of a law and order episode, depending on the jurisdiction of a court, application of the law, and the presentation of objective proof that an individual committed the deed. Crucially, in a reasonable society, criminal guilt is a high bar to clear, and often subject to loopholes, which is why unethical actors are typically at pains to prove that they followed the letter of the law, even when committing what most people would think are unethical acts. On the other hand, in a dystopian society like totalitarian Germany, criminal guilt may also stand in opposition to ethical action. Nearly every individual prosecuted at Nuremberg put forward as part of their defense that to defy orders, to oppose the Holocaust, was a violation of German law and would have made them a criminal in the eyes of the state. For Jaspers, criminal guilt ends where state authority disappears and can only be applied to individuals. Political guilt, on the other hand, applies to entire states and is imposed by the international community. Just as domestic law may be unethical, Jaspers remains realistic about the ethical content of international law as well. The question of political guilt is one of force and victory. Force is what decides between men, unless they reach agreement. Any state order serves to control this force so as to preserve it, as law enforcement within, as war without. It is up to the victor to decide what to do with the vanquished. Political guilt is that which is imposed on the vanquished state by the victor, and it is imposed not only on individual statesmen, but on the entire population. Everybody is co-responsible for the way he is governed. While it seems obvious, this was an odd argument for a liberal philosopher to make at the time, as many sought to justify the Nuremberg Trials on the basis of natural law, and as a legitimate extension of both the Geneva Conventions and the authority of the newly created United Nations. Historically, Nuremberg was a first step on the way to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Criminal Court. Jaspers acknowledges this, saying that right is a basis upon which both victor and vanquished may appeal. But he is clear that the Nuremberg trials, whatever their justification, were an event that became the fundament of a positive, factual law, which is not justified through right. Why undermine natural law? The reason is psychological. Jaspers acknowledges political reality in order to cut off lines of argumentation from the supporters of the Nazi regime. If they were not prosecuted, he says, it was due to the mercy of the victor, not due to their rightness or even to the mere acceptability of their actions. Jaspers wants to break any connection between the contingent legal and political processes involved in persecuting individual members of the Nazi leadership and the broader moral responsibility that needed to be shouldered by all Germans, himself included, for their participation in and failure to prevent the Holocaust. Jaspers' emphasis on universal responsibility brings us to the final two categories: moral guilt and metaphysical guilt. Both are universal, and neither is dependent on the judgments of external figures. Jurisdiction rests either with my conscience or with God alone. The difference is in how they arise. Moral guilt is that which each individual feels in response to their own actions or inactions. I, who cannot act otherwise than as an individual, am morally responsible for all my deeds, including the execution of political and military orders. It is never true that orders are orders. Metaphysical guilt goes a step further and stems from each individual's co-responsibility for every wrong and every injustice in the world, especially for those crimes committed in his presence or with his knowledge. If I fail to do whatever I can to prevent them, I too am guilty. If I was present at the murder of others without risking my life to prevent it, I feel guilty in a way not adequately conceivable either legally, politically, or morally. Some aspects of metaphysical guilt may sit with you uncomfortably. Jaspers may provoke your outrage. How can I be held responsible for every injustice in the world? I am not God. I am merely human, all too human. Such perfectionism is not only beyond me, it is unfair. Jaspers intended to provoke this response. I will return to some of these criticisms later, but first, I want to ask why he thought taking such an uncompromising stance was necessary. Some philosophers, and most philosophy undergraduates and politicians, badly want to connect criminal or political guilt with questions of moral responsibility. Jaspers tells us that this impulse is a clear category mistake, and he does so to cut off two lines of excuses that could be raised by former Nazis and fence-sitters wanting to excuse their action or inaction during the Holocaust. The first line of argument, which I mentioned earlier, was directed at the Nuremberg Trials themselves. Those accused, typically the worst of the Nazi war criminals, were at pains to discredit the proceedings as illegal and to exonerate their own actions as directed by the state. Rather than deflecting the criticism with an appeal to natural law, Jaspers confronts it head-on, in the starkly realist terms he thinks will be most easily understood and accepted by the accused. He does this, much like Thrasymachus in Plato's Republic, with an appeal to naked force. Both criminal guilt and political guilt stem from the rule of vae victis, or woe to the conquered. Criminal guilt stems from the application of force by the state onto its citizens, what Weber called the monopoly on the legitimate use of force. And political guilt takes over where the state itself has become the vanquished, and therefore illegitimate in the eyes of the victors. Jaspers argues that Nuremberg is actually an expression of mercy by the victors, punishing only those most responsible for the crimes of World War II and the Holocaust, and largely exempting those bystanders who failed to stop them. Had the Nazis succeeded, they could hardly have been expected to be so restrained. Indeed, where Nuremberg assigned responsibility solely to individuals, the Nazis had falsely assigned responsibility to entire groups, be it the Jews, the Roma, or the gay and disabled, among many others. Thus, the Allies show mercy in victory, where the Nazis would show only cruelty. A second line of argument was often raised, both by the fence-sitters and by those Nazis who wished to appear less guilty than they actually were. The apathetic and the cowardly argued that they were wholly impotent and unable to impact the course of events that led to the Holocaust. And perhaps, in many cases, they were relatively or even wholly impotent. Jaspers does not deny that such cases exist. In fact, He himself is one such case. Jaspers was Christian, but married to Gertrude Meyer, a Jewish woman. He was banned from teaching and publication starting in 1937, and only allowed to re-enter academia at the end of the war. He and his wife lived in Heidelberg, and were under the constant threat of removal to the concentration camps. The Nazis gave Jaspers permission to leave for Switzerland in 1942, owing to his calling in favors from some influential friends, but they refused to extend that permission to his Jewish wife. Jaspers, impotent but not a coward, refused to abandon Gertrude. In 1945, towards the end of the war, he received notice from friends that their deportation was scheduled for April 14th, and the couple made plans to take cyanide rather than submit. In a stroke of luck, the Allies would occupy Heidelberg on March 30th, and the Nazis' plans were put permanently on hold. It would be beyond difficult, and likely impossible, to adequately assign criminal guilt to all such cases. Yet, Jaspers does not wish to excuse average Germans, even those who quietly and discreetly resisted the regime. Everyone could have done more, but their desire to survive prevented more forceful action. In such a circumstance, the mere fact of survival imposes a weight of guilt on the survivor. We are guilty of being alive. We know before God, which deeply humiliates us. What happened to us in these 12 years is like a transmutation of our being. Moral and metaphysical guilt exist to fill in the massive gap left behind by legal and political mechanisms. They rely not upon an external and human judge, but upon the internal conscience of the guilty and the common humanity of all people. Here, it is worth quoting Jaspers at length, as he directly addresses the Kristallnacht pogrom and the horrors that followed. In November 1938, when the synagogues burned and Jews were deported for the first time, the guilt incurred was chiefly moral and political. In either sense, the guilty were those still in power. The generals stood by. In every town, the commander could act against crime, for the soldier is there to protect all. If crime occurs on such a scale that the police cannot or fail to stop it, they did nothing. At that moment, they forsook the once glorious ethical tradition of the German army. It was not their business. They had dissociated themselves from the soul of the German people in favor of an absolute military machine that was a law unto itself and took orders. True, among our people, many were outraged and many deeply moved by a horror containing a presentiment of coming calamity. But even more went right on with their activities, undisturbed in their social life and amusement, as if nothing had happened. That is moral guilt. But the ones who in utter impotence, outraged and despairing, were unable to prevent the crimes, took another step in their metamorphosis by a growing consciousness of metaphysical guilt. The example of Kristallnacht serves as a crystallization of Jaspers' goal. In bringing moral and metaphysical guilt into the discussion, he seeks to avoid all individual excuses for group actions. Criminal responsibility may apply solely to the actions of the individual, but in the question of moral responsibility, those who participated in a political enterprise cannot so easily set their guilt aside. In his explanation of the importance of moral guilt and our collective responsibility for national atrocities, Jaspers emphasizes two essential aspects of our responsibility: the problem of submission to authority and inaction, and the importance of national narratives and collective history in fertilizing the growth of violence and mindless hatred. Both of these apply today. I am discussing America, and especially the problem of the Department of Homeland Security atrocities in Minneapolis, but I would urge everyone listening to this video to reflect on their own national situation. We are all in danger of ignoring these narratives and submitting to cruel authorities. Whether you are British and thinking about Brexit, French and considering Marine Le Pen, Italian and worried about the growing influence of Alessandro Mussolini and the rightward shift of the Forza Italia, or living in an outright authoritarian state, we all have aspects of our national political realities which we should better oppose. Let's look first at the problem of submission. Jaspers draws an analogy between political support and marriage. The unconditional attachment to one person, which is possible and proper in a marriage, is pernicious in principle in a state. The loyalty of followers is a non-political relationship limited to narrow circles and primitive circumstances. In a free state, all men are subject to control and change. Hence, there is a twofold guilt. First, in the unconditional political surrender to a leader as such, and second, in the kind of leader submitted to. The atmosphere of submission is a sort of collective guilt. In addition, there is our moral guilt. Although this always burdens only the individual, who must get along with himself, there is still a sort of collective morality contained in the ways of life and feeling, from which no individual can escape and which have political significance as well. Here is the key to self-improvement. Its use is up to us. This passage is more complex than it seems at first glance, because the act of submission happens at multiple levels. On one level, there is the submission of a follower, which Jaspers likens to the submission of a marriage, which both Nietzsche and Weber likened to a religious impulse. Today, we might call it the problem of our dear leader, which is the essence of the MAGA movement and Trumpism. The leader can do no wrong, and the leader's narrative cannot be opposed. As Orwell would later point out in 1984, in such a regime, truth has no place, and words cease to have their normal meaning. But even if the problem of mindless followers is the core of the demagogue's power, the guilt of submission goes even further. If in a free state, all men are subject to control and change, then the leader himself must also be subject to control, by the institutions of representative government and by the regular expression of the will of the people, whether through elections, judicial restraints on executive overreach, collective protest, or active resistance to illegal government actions. This is why submission is a form of collective guilt. Popular submission to government atrocities means that our collective moral compass is broken, and we have lost our political courage. We have become afraid to speak up, or worse, we have submitted to nihilism. We no longer see the point in political action. Today, this takes many forms. But perhaps the most obvious is political doomerism on social media, and clout farmers who draw false equivalences between Trump and Democrats. Another, less online version of the problem is making excuses to not attend a political protest or to not call your political representatives because you believe they are all bought and sold. This is an area where we could all do better, myself included. I have made excuses to not attend protests in the past, claiming physical disabilities make protesting hard for me, which is true, but not the only reason, and maybe not the central one. In truth, I have also avoided protests simply because I was afraid, whether of political retribution, or the scorn of my employer, or of the potential for physical harm. In those moments, I, like many others, gave into the intimidation of the regime. And for that, there is no excuse, and I should do better. This is why Jaspers says our sense of moral guilt is the key to self-improvement. Guilt can drive us to action. Moral guilt, The sense of moral responsibility and outrage at injustice is the driving force behind the Minneapolis ICE observer movement today. It is the source of both their tenacity and also the profound restraint the observers have demonstrated. Restraint that has made the brutal executions of Rene Good and Alex Preti into galvanizing national events. Our outrage over our own moral guilt can be turned to good use, converted into what Gandhi and Martin Luther King called soul force. It can become our source of inspiration for action. But even action in moments of crisis is insufficient. For all the soul force of the resistance, we must do even better. Because we are all guilty for allowing matters to get out of control, for allowing a demagogue to rise and hatred and violence to come to our streets. Violence is never as sudden as it appears. It grows out of seeds of hatred and resentment, fertilized by narratives of group supremacy, whether ethnic, religious, or ideological. As Jaspers put it in the context of the Holocaust, we have to bear the guilt of our fathers. That the spiritual conditions of German life provided an opportunity for such a regime is a fact for which all of us are co-responsible. Our national tradition contains something, mighty and threatening, which is our moral ruin. Although Jaspers does not offer a detailed analysis of the German national narrative, today we know that to vastly simplify, the essential problem was twofold. First, a tradition of eugenicism and hierarchical racial categorization in the scientific community, and second, a national narrative of imperialist expansion that began with Frederick the Great. These two elements combined to form a virulent plague of expansionist hypernationalism that led to the rise of totalitarian ideologies. So how did we, as Americans, arrive in a similar place today? What is it in our national tradition, history, and political narratives that has led us to this point? As I see it, there are at least 4 components that interact with each other to breed violence. Since I do want to end on a hopeful note, and I don't want to get bogged down in arguments about their relative importance, I will mention each briefly and leave it to you, my viewers, to learn more. First, and most obvious, is the submission to fear after September 11th, 2001. This fear led directly to the control of the Department of Homeland Security, which includes ICE and the Border Patrol, the legitimization of surveillance in the Patriot Act, the militarization of U.S. law enforcement, and the legitimization of state violence without due process at Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib. What began as Islamophobia and was limited to those accused of terrorism and held in military prisons has expanded to immigrants and protesters across America today. Second, the U.S. has, historically, failed to punish extreme lying and corruption in politics. The lack of lasting consequences breeds nihilism on the part of voters, leading to the widespread sentiment that voting doesn't matter and both parties are the same. There are many prominent examples since World War II, including McCarthyism and the Red Scare, Reagan and the Iran-Contra scandal, Watergate and Richard Nixon's pardon by President Ford, and Trump's first term and the January 6th insurrection, including Merrick Garland's failure to prosecute. All of these incidents have suppressed voter turnout and led to false belief that politics doesn't matter and that all politicians are out to get us. Nihilism has likewise led to the belief in the political consultant class that Americans do not care about morals, but only about kitchen table issues. Neither is true, and we need to fight these nihilistic impulses at every turn. Third, the history of the Christian right and white nationalism in America. What began with the failure of Reconstruction and the century of lynchings, massacres, and Jim Crow laws that followed, and spread to the North with the rise of the Know Nothing Party in the 1880s and anti-Semitism before and after World War II, including the Hollywood blacklists during McCarthyism. The Christian right views other faiths as inferior and illegitimate, is deeply connected with America's history of racial oppression, and seeks to impose its own narrow worldview on everyone without concern for the challenges of living in a pluralist, free society. Perhaps most importantly for the current regime, it has also become connected to the prosperity gospel, where material prosperity is taken as a sign of one's moral uprightness, which has provided significant support for Trump's political ambitions, given his narrative of being a successful businessman, and has done similar favors in promoting the cult around Elon Musk. Fourth, and finally, the historical belief in American exceptionalism. This is the oldest, most enduring myth in American society. Americans have always believed that we are somehow unique. A Puritan city on a hill, the first modern democracy, a land of freedom and equality. Unfortunately, rather than inspire us to greater heights of empathy, this belief has led us to be myopically convinced of our own rightness, to ignore our culpability for historical atrocities against minorities and our neighbors, and fed the fires of territorial expansion and global political dominance. Exceptionalism has bred a sense of entitlement, and our failure to live up to that exceptionalism contributes to the political nihilism that is so common today. Some examples include our historical belief in manifest destiny and the genocide and forced religious conversion of First Nations, whether it was the Trail of Tears, Wounded Knee, or the cultural genocide of boarding schools and the forced adoption of Indigenous children. The American sense of entitlement in interfering in the affairs of all countries in the Western Hemisphere, the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt Corollary, and their later manifestations in American rightness in preventing communism by overthrowing Latin American leaders during the Cold War, a direct antecedent of Trump's actions in Venezuela this year. Our belief that Latin American countries cannot be trusted to run their own affairs is the international relations equivalent of the domestic belief in white superiority and that immigrants are lazy and unworthy of living in America. Finally, our sense, following World War II, that we were the bastion of democracy and saved Europe from the scourge of totalitarianism, ignoring the vastly large numbers of Europeans who died in the war. This belief served to mask the failures of democracy here at home, and to justify the belief in regime change that left so many young Americans jaded after the Iraq War. It also became the foundation of the MAGA belief that Europeans don't contribute to their own security and can be bullied into accepting whatever America wants, apparently up to and including the annexation of Greenland. Some of you watching, perhaps many of you, may think I go too far. Others may think it all sounds like too much for one person to change. We can each only do so much as individuals. But that limited capacity does not absolve us from our collective responsibility. It does not absolve us from trying. The current state of affairs should make you angry. The danger is that anger will make us unfocused, that we will lash out at our friends and allies, picking unnecessary fights and failing to choose solidarity with all those in our country who do stand for human rights and freedom. There are good ways and bad ways to make use of anger and frustration. In that vein, I would like to leave you all with a quote from one of my favorite authors, the late Sir Terry Pratchett. Genuine anger was one of the world's greatest creative forces, but you had to learn how to control it. That didn't mean you let it trickle away. It meant you damned it, carefully. Let it develop a working head, let it drown whole valleys of the mind, and then, just when the whole structure was about to collapse, opened a tiny pipeline at the base, and let the iron-hard steam of wrath power the turbines of revenge. Just a brief channel update today. If you watched the last video, you know I was planning on releasing a video on Machiavelli next. That video is recorded, and I'm currently editing it. But with everything that happened over the last month, it was important to me to get to Jaspers first, because he offers such direct insights on our current political situation. Machiavelli is still on the agenda, as are the Dreyfus Affair, Hannah Arendt, and Albert Hirschman. As always, thank you all for watching, and if you liked the video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. Your support is what makes this content possible.